Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Inês Hipólito. She is a faculty member at Macquarie University, where she serves as a lecturer, that is the same as assistant professor of philosophy of AI, and a researcher at the Ethics and Agency Research Center. She has some other affiliations, which I will be leaving in the description of this video, and also a link to our first interview. Please check it out because it's very interesting and also gives some background to some of the things we're talking about today, which is computational representational approaches and dynamical approaches in cognitive science. We're also talking about 4E cognition. And we're focusing mostly on a paper titled Mind as Motion Patterns from Psychology to Neurobiology. So Inês, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. The pleasure is mine.
Okay, so let's start with this. I think that last time we've already somewhat touched on this topic, but to really give people a clearer picture of what we're talking about here. So in cognitive science, there are what people call computational slash representational approaches and also dynamical approaches. So what are the main differences there?
Okay, all right. So let's say that there are quite a few differences. Let's just say that there are two main fields in which they differ. Let's say philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. So in terms of representational approaches, a representational approach of mind is any theory that somewhat reduces cognitive activity or the activities that we as human beings or even non-human animals engage with to mental representation. Now, needless to say that there are too many notions of mental representation, and it's quite difficult to for someone to have a working definition because it would not do justice to the rich literature that we find in philosophy of mind about what a mental representation is. So there is, of course, no consensus, and sometimes the notion is used in a very, very strong sense. Sometimes it's used in a weaker sense. So some examples of it is that mental representation can be thought in the very strong sense of being of having some kind of like content semantic properties, in which case a mental representation would be anything that is like a sentence that says something about the world, a map that somewhat tries to represent the world. A picture would also be a mental representation. So anything that with which we are trying to convey a certain meaning about the world that has this kind of like semantic properties, this content, that would be a mental representation. So another interesting feature of mental representation is that it must have, or it does have, at least as it is theorized, typically it has truth conditions. And truth conditions are just this simple idea that when I make a map about the world, let's say that I want to show you the way to go from point A to B in Lisbon. I'm going to draw a map for you to get there, right? So then there's a way in which that map that I'm drawing is going to be either true or false. It represents well or it misrepresents. Either you get there or you don't by virtue of the map. So that's the idea. So that's what we mean with truth conditions, right? So to go back to the beginning of the question, some theories such as cognitivism or the representational theory of mind or computational theory of mind, they do defend that the cognitive activities that living beings engage with come down to mental representations. So to this very kind of like very intellectual way of engaging or interacting with the world in that very sense of almost like thinking, kind of. This is a very ontological property, because we are saying that cognition is mental representation. Some people refer to it as the mark of the mental is mental representation. And these are the theories that have been mostly around, and they are the mainstream theories in analytic theory of mind or analytic philosophy of mind. So those are the theories that are also in the foundations of cognitive science. So cognitive science borrows a lot or a great deal from this view that cognition, or the mark of the mental, is mental representation. So then once we are trading in these waters, in these theoretical waters, then what we are saying is that whatever activity that we see humans engaging with, be it perceiving something, remembering something, imagining, making mathematical calculations, interacting with each other, any activity that we are able to do as we navigate the world can be or should be explained through the notion of mental representation. So it involves and entails mental representation. So this is the mental representational theory of mind, the strong view. And then there are somewhat like weaker views, in which case they kind of like deflate on the notion of like the semantic content. So they do not necessarily endorse the view that there is semantic content, but that it's more like a structural, isomorphic relation between the idea that one has in mind and the world, so to speak, outside. So this is like sort of like in a nutshell, trying to, give a very brief introduction to computational theory of mind, or representationalist accounts of mind.
Mm-hmm. I wasn't sure if you wanted to add something else, or.
Yeah. So basically, then you also asked me what is the difference between the representationalist and the dynamical theory of mind. It's completely different. I usually say that as we are thinking about a problem in cognitive science, or in any problem in science for that matter, it's quite interesting because it always depends on the goggles that one puts on, and then we start off with different ways of thinking the same or looking at the same phenomenon. And it's very interesting that in the case of dynamical systems theory, it is not as heavily charged with representationalist accounts. And I'm going to say more than that. I'm going to say that it's not only that that's the case, but some papers are very clearly, and some work, especially by Tim van Helder, who's been very influential in dynamical systems theory, they are very clearly against thinking of the mind as the mark of the mental being a mental representation or being a computation. So they're strongly against thinking about the mind as analogous to a computer who performs a certain computation in order to output a mental representation. So dynamical systems theory rejects any mind-machine metaphor, which is usually what is the case associated with representationalist theories of mind.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I know that this is much more complex and broad, but unfortunately, we don't have, enough time to really get into the details of it. But I will also refer to other interviews that will be coming out on the show in the near future. For example, I had one with Dr. Randall Beer, where we really get into the nitty-gritty of what a representation is, what computation means, and all of that, and some of the differences between representational or computational approaches and dynamical approaches in cognitive science. We had a 90-minute interview just about that. So when it comes out, please check it out. But last time we talked about a lot about enactivism. And it is now part, or at least for some people, it is part of a broader framework that is the 4E cognition framework that includes, that means that the mind is embodied, extended, embedded, and inactive. So what does the other three E's, let's say, what do they mean exactly, and what do they add to the picture?
All right, okay, so it's interesting. I'm happy that you asked this question after asking about mental representation, because it's like all roads in these topics lead to the notion of mental representation and where the players position themselves in relation to the notion of mental representation, whether we would want it or not. But so let's say that yes, we do have all of these like frameworks. There's also ecological psychology as well. We have all these E's, and how we think about these E's can be thought in relation to the notion of mental representation. So how is it that they, if at all, reject the notion of mental representation? So within enactivism, I can think of at least three different kinds of enactivism. So it's not just one big happy family. They do have many commonalities, but they also have their own very idiosyncratic and rich theories. So even within enactivism, there are varieties of enactivism. So, but then as about the other, in terms of the other E's, it is quite interesting because it's the same applies. The E cognitive science is a happy family. There are some commonalities and there are some points of departure, and it's quite interesting to study that in itself. It is very worthwhile to study and understand that in itself. So then we have, for example, embodiment, right, or embodied cognitive science, and I'm going to start there because that particular framework seems to be the one that in the literature sort of like started this kind of like wave or movement of going into this E-cognitive science now, because then other E's were coming in. Embodied cognitive science or embodiment has its roots in phenomenology and in pragmatism. It's been around for a while. It's not news. These are not new arguments that are being developed and brand new. I mean, it owes so much to the rich literature of phenomenology. And what is the main focus of embodiment? Embodiment focuses mostly on highlighting the importance of the body, of the grounding of the body, as a relational aspect of the experience that one has. So the situatedness of the experience that one has, which is part of the cognitive development, which is part of our psychological experience, that experience is meaningful by virtue of the body that one is grounded at, right? So it comes from all of these like beautiful literature, such as, for example, Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. And in that book, he says something that I think is really useful to understand embodiment in cognitive science, that the hand is next to me in a way that the computer is not, right? So it's this kind of like directedness towards the world by virtue of being in the lived body, as it is explained in embodiment. So the focus in embodied cognitive science or embodiment is the body. So that's quite interesting, and I think that all the E's do bring a different story to the table to get to a certain to a common point in a way. So in embodiment we have, of course, the body as the grounding, and it's such a vast and incredible literature. And then we move to the extended mind. So the extended mind had a very important role in the 90s, in 99. Because it spoke to the literature on connectionism, computational theory of mind. So it kind of like touched that nerve in saying that the cognition does not reduce to a mind machine, so a brain machine that produces computational mental representations. So this was the job at the time with the extended mind that was quite crucial, because they come in and they say the body plays a role. Mm-hmm. And this was quite revolutionary if one wasn't already within the neighborhood of embodiment. If one wasn't already sold to embodiment and phenomenology and pragmatism by peers, if one were not already in that kind of like realm, then well, that was a very interesting and revolutionary concept for Annie Clark and David Chalmers to bring up, that the body plays a role in the interaction with the world, so much so they continue that we can dovetail or attach or expand our body by virtue of utilizing certain technological tools. So then the revolutionary idea there is revolutionary only against the background of orthodox or traditional philosophy of mind that conceives the mind to be encapsulated in the brain and doesn't really give any relevance to the body. But that was already around with embodiment and embodied cognitive science and phenomenology, so it's not completely brand new. Where does it differ? Is that the extended mind has or holds a weak account of embodiment versus embodiment which holds a strong account of embodiment. Why is it a weak account? It is a weak account because the extended mind is still an account that holds that the mark of the mental is mental representation. So the body serves the role of allowing the mind in the brain to interact with the environment so as to collect more evidence for the mind to process, compute what it needs to be computed, and that we call cognition. And it does so in such a nice way that it also can incorporate tools or objects or technology that will be part, that have a causal role in the ways that the mind works, in the ways that cognition works. So that's how these are completely different in the way that we have a computational theory of mind. It's just that it's expanded towards the tools through the body. That's the extended mind. And then we have embodied cognitive science, which rejects that cognition comes down to mental representations and the body plays a role in a very phenomenological sense. So then we have these two. And then we have embedded. Embedded is, let's put it in a range and say which one of the E's is closest to mental representation or the computational theory of mind, or let's say the traditional philosophy of mind. Well, embeddedness would be the closest to computational theory of mind, because, and then you would have the extended mind, and then you would have embodiment and then activism. So embeddedness is just this view that, well, cognition does not occur or does not take place or does not unfold in an encapsulated manner. It is situated, it is embedded in an environment. Now, we might now, from this point on, differ in the ways in which we explain how that embeddedness works, right? Then now we can go and say in a very much more stronger way with embodiment, or we can go with a weaker way with the extended mind, right? And then we have the enactivisms, which I'm not sure if you want me to go over the varieties of enactivisms.
I mean, if you want to get into it, last time we've already spent perhaps half of the interview talking about enactivism, but I'm not sure if you mentioned at any point the varieties of enactivism. So yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so in very brief, so even enactivism itself also positions itself according to the notion of mental representation. Here, the question is, how much do you incorporate, if at all, the notion of mental representation, right? So if one thinks that there is some sort of theoretical modeling or knowledge-based guidelines that are guiding action and interaction with the world, such that interaction is not interaction, but it is mediated by some kind of like following a book of rules, which would be knowledge, then there would be a more a closer to representationalism way of thinking of enactivism. Mm-hmm. If one thinks that not all interactions with the environment are going to entail mental representation or any kind of like, even if loosely modeling the world, following a kind of like a road book, then one would be in a more radical side of enactivism. So then we have somewhat, we can think of three different varieties somewhat, because more recently there's been some work that combines embodiment and enactivist ideas, right? So let's call it embodied enactivism. Okay. So there is that particular case where people combine these two. I'm thinking, for example, of the work of Sean Gallagher. He's got enactivist interventions, where it's very clear that there is a very close connection between phenomenology and enactivism. But then you have the earliest version of enactivism, which is the one that was put forward by Varela and by Varela and Maturana, and they were extraordinary at the time because they bring in these ideas from biology, and specifically the notion of autopoiesis and self-organization, and it's quite interesting and relevant for the history of philosophy of mind and the history of cognitive science. Those ideas were at the time. More recently, autopoietic enactivism by Maturana and Varela has been redefined or has been developed under other very important researchers who have been developing ideas such as that the system is operationally closed but thermodynamically open. And for that reason, it is in this state of precariousness. It needs to interact with the environment in order to survive. So these are all ideas that are extremely interesting, and they are completely different to the computational theory of mind, as you can see, because there is not an understanding of the mind in a computational way. So that kind of metaphor is completely rejected. So as you can see, it is much more inspired in biology. And, for example, in the self-organization of a cell, right? So it's much more biological inspiration in this autopoietic enactivism. So then you have concepts that come up, for example, in works of Evan Thompson or of Ezekiel de Paul or Anna de Jager, who bring up these concepts of sense-making, in an attempt to tone down the idea that all cognitive interactions with the world or all cognitive activity comes down to the notion of mental representation, as if one is all the time intellectualizing as one engages with the world and engages in activities with the world, as if one were to be all the time, everywhere, intellectualizing, thinking, such that mental representation would be the mark of that interaction, right? So that's what is pushed back across the board. And then, of course, there are like different strategies in which one pushes back on the idea that cognition reduces to mental representation. And it's quite interesting because I've been in my interactions with a lot of people. I was surprised. I'm surprised when people think of enactivism as not being at least convincing, so to speak, because it completely rejects the notion of mental representations. Excuse me, that's not the case. And there's a tendency to think that that's the case. That is not the case. The idea is to explain at what stage of cognitive interaction or cognitive development do mental representations show up in the picture, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the idea. It's not to reject mental representations. It's the idea that, okay, we go back to Plato. Let's go back to Plato and think about how Plato was explaining interaction and the mind. Well, there are these ideas that one is born with, but we forgot at birth, and then as we interact with the world, we remember these ideas. It's a very Cartesian way of thinking about the mind, right? But then what e-cognition does is it asks, wait a minute, where are these ideas coming from? Where is this content coming from? Where is this semantic content coming from? You have to give us an explanation of that. Otherwise, we're just going to have to go with Plato and just accept it at face value. You can't just do that. So that's a pressure that e-cognition puts upon computational accounts of mind, which at the end of the day are accounts that defend that the computation taking place is a computation for the purpose of delivering an output that is a mental representation. And then there are different theories and different categories that one can pursue. So all the E's are united in saying, look, we are not going to take that at face value. We need, if there is content, semantic content coming up, such that I can now draw a map so that you can go from point A to B in Lisbon, then at some point we had to gain this kind of content and understanding and skills in cognitive development. And we want to understand when and where and how.
Mm-hmm.
That's
right.
The view brief.
No, that's okay. But I mean, let me just also refer the listeners and the viewers to an interview that will also be coming out later this year with Dr. Philip Hiver, because we've talked there about computational/representational approaches and dynamical approaches applied to language learning in the classroom. And at a certain point there, you mentioned that, for example, enactivism does not reject the notion of representation, at least not entirely. And hopefully we'll get time to come back to this point later on today. But in that interview with Dr. Hiver, we even talked about pluralistic approaches in cognitive science and psychology, because he said basically that he doesn't think that, for example, dynamical approaches, at least in his mind, are here to just replace the rest, but to complement what other approaches bring to the table. But let's see if we can come back to this point later on in our conversation. So getting into then your paper that I mentioned in the introduction, Mind as Motion, that you wrote together with Paul van Geert and Luis Pessoa. So you argue there for a shift in psychology toward dynamic processes. So could you explain what does that mean? What does that entail exactly? And isn't it the case that here we wouldn't be talking just about a change in the way we look at the mind in psychology, epistemically speaking, but also ontologically speaking? I mean, doesn't this entail also an ontological shift in the way we think about the mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we propose, it's important to credit researchers in dynamical and complex systems theory. What we propose is in this shift is to reinforce the shift. So we are not claiming something brand new. We are, as we usually say, sitting on giants' shoulders, right? And trying to, keep developing the theory further. So that's what we're trying to do in that paper. So for starters, because we are in this within this framework of dynamical and complex systems theory, we are thinking in a completely different way about the mind and cognition as compared to more traditional computational accounts of the mind. In which case, put in very simple terms and probably being very unfair, the idea is that the mind is analogous to a computer machine, and then there are different accounts in which you can propose this, right? So it's an analogous computer, it's a digital computer, it's a Bayesian inference machine, right? So there are many different ways that you can pursue those lines of reasoning and see what kind of epistemic gain you get from thinking about the mind in those ways. We started off with Turing machines, then we went to parallel distributed processing. Now we are in the Bayesian era, right? So there's, and of course that as we go into computational modeling, I believe that those can illuminate some part of the way, but they are assumptions. So when one says that the mind is a machine, that's an assumption, right? That's not a scientific fact. That's almost a first step to take something off the ground. We have to start somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. But here's where philosophy of mind is really important, because it cannot be that anything goes, right? It cannot be. So this is the first step, is to think that the mind is a machine. Okay, but we have to accept it as this assumption, but we can also question it, right? So in order for us to start understanding certain theory that is which the first step is the mind being a machine, we can play along and continue and see how we go. But we can also question that very first assumption that the mind is a machine, and say, well, that is not a scientific fact. And moreover, there is very little philosophical reasoning to convince that that is the case. So that's where you start with dynamical systems theory, when you do a little bit more of philosophical theory of mind work within dynamical systems theory. It is really important to stress this, that dynamical systems theory is a mathematical formalism, and it can be used to model anything that is an open system in the environment. So it's not something that is just for the mind and brain or cognitive science. It's not, right? It's a super rigorous mathematical formalism that we use that is, for example, super close to Newtonian mechanics, for example, and it serves the purpose of allowing us to model the behavior and predict the behavior of any system that is an open system. Any system that is an open system can be said to be a complex system. So the complexity of a system is extremely interesting as well, in the sense that even complexity is not only solely something that we talk about within cognitive science, right? Complexity, the definition of complexity is how hard it is for us, with our computational tools that we develop in our science and our technology. So we got this computational power, how hard it is for us to model a certain behavior of a system in the environment, a system that lives in the environment, that behaves in the environment. How hard is it for us to model that, because we don't have, or we lack, the computational power, because we don't have that capacity. So a system is more complex in relation and proportional to how difficult it is for us to be able to model it because we lack the computational power. Now, the brain is one of those systems. Mm-hmm. It's extremely complex. It's very difficult to model the brain. Human behavior is another example of that. It's extremely difficult. And we usually say, why is it so difficult? Well, because it's got many degrees of freedom. What does this mean? This means that there are so many states, or the state space is so large in which we can find the system living, that is really hard to predict. Now, one could even wonder which one is the most complex, or higher in complexity. Is it human behavior, or is it the brain? It's quite interesting, isn't it, to think about it, right? Because one thinks about the brain, or mostly some more brain-centered theories of mind, they put the brain in such high stakes that the brain is where cognition lives, right? And I just turn things around, and I'm like, I don't know which one is the most complex one, to be honest, because to model the behavior, let's say that I want to model social cognition, and I put people interacting with each other. There's no way that I can predict, right, or model that kind of interaction, because there's so many degrees of freedom, right? And yet one tends to think it's the brain as being that super powerful machine where, you know, all of these important things for cognition happen, and dismiss completely the embodied interactions with other people and the environment around, right? So this is where, this precisely in this reasoning and in these observations, that e-cognition and dynamical systems theory can complement each other, is in this questioning of, first, the idea that the mind is reduced to a computer. What computer? The brain, right? So that's the first thing that is put aside. Like, that doesn't make sense whatsoever. That must be completely wrong. It's reductionistic in the sense that, not even in the usual sense of the word reductionism, but in the sense that it lacks imagination. It's very rudimentary thinking. It's a very simple way of thinking of something as high and rich and dynamic as human behavior, or even other animals' behavior, or even the nervous system as an organ that in itself is distributed across the body, because people tend to think it's inside the skull. It's distributed across the body, and it is interacting permanently, continuously interacting with other systems in the body, without which we could not be having these conversations, right? And then, so all of these interactions within the body are also situated within an organism that is situated in the environment. So all of us, it's sitting in the e-cognition and dynamical systems theory, we just find it really hard to accept the analogy of the brain being this computational machine. We understand that for some purposes, in a very pre-scientific way, that one could think like that. But the problem is what we have now is that, because we started that as a somewhat of like an analogy that started back in the day when Turing machines came up. But even before that, since Aristotle, there's a comparison of the mind with at the time was a slate of calculations that Aristotle was comparing the mind to. So this is not news, but the idea is that instead of that being just a metaphor to aid us think about it and talk to each other and convey thoughts to each other, eventually it metamorphosed into something that is ontological. It must be the case that the brain is, not like, is a machine, right? And then the whole cognitive science might unfold around that conception that started as a metaphor and became ontology, right? So that's kind of like the pressure that we put on. Like, that's not ontology. It might have had some uses, even though many people in e-cognition and dynamical systems theory, they would reject that it is even useful. And I would agree with that, in the sense that, because if you start off with that kind of a thinking, that is going to definitely point the direction of the research, of the empirical research, of the formulation and development of the theories. So it is already constraining thinking, right? So once you go that path, that's the path, right? So we are on a different path when we think about these things, and we want to reject the view of the mind being a machine. And one of the reasons for that is it's quite simple. It's the observation that behavior of living systems, from bacteria to a living organ of the body, to the body of, say, a non-human animal, to the organism of a human animal. It's so interactive, and it's got, in that interactions, it's got so many degrees of freedom that that cannot, we need to, at least, if nothing else, we need to protect those levels of complexity and refrain from reducing it to very simple explanations that are metaphorical, right? So we want to go for the hard questions, even if we don't have the answers or we don't have the tools to understand, but we want to keep the reasoning that it is extremely complex. If it weren't that complex, then we would by now understand and be able to predict with very good levels of certainty the behaviors, but we don't, because it is extremely rich, it is extremely complex, and we don't have the computational power to do that. So then the dynamical systems theory, or the complex systems theory, is a framework that brings in some mathematical weaponry or machinery that is going to complement many of the thinkings and many of the reasonings that come up within the e-cognition literature, which is the rejection of the cognition reduces to the mind machine that computes mental representations, and that would be the explanatory or the explanation for, and should be found as a mark of the mental in all of the activities that we find human beings or non-human animals engaging with in the environment.
Well, maybe if we had technologies different from computers that were more influential in our culture, or perhaps other aspects of our environment, that we would make analogies to the brain, maybe we wouldn't be stuck with this idea of the brain as a computer. right?
Absolutely. But the more interesting thing is that for some reason, when we look at the history of cognitive science within the landscape, almost like it's always been there, because biology has always been there. And there's this very famous quote, which is "the world is its best model," and it is usually used for some other purpose, but I'm going to use it here for this purpose. When we want to study, for example, the brain, what would be the motivation to come up with an analogy of the brain with a machine, when we do have other analogies that are much closer to biology and the natural world, as opposed to what? As opposed to human-made objects, such as computation. So computation, a computer, is a human-made object, right? So it lacks all of the properties that any other natural system does, like self-organizing, non-linearity, all of those more complex kind of like properties of these natural systems are lacking in computers. And yet for the purposes, for scientific purposes, history has been repeating itself, such that now we have a new theory of mind, and that theory is going to be the best available technology of that time, right? And then it's just comparing the mind with a machine. I think that's wrong. I think that's extremely simpleton, and there are much better, if we want a metaphor, there are much better metaphors that we can find that are so much closer property-wise, so much in property and in kind, so much closer to what the nervous system is about and doing and its activity, as well as how it interacts with the other systems within an organism, and an organism itself in the environment. So that's where the dynamical and complex systems theory comes handy, because dynamical and complex systems theory is here around to model systems that change in time. That's a dynamical system. Any system that changes behavior in time, that evolves in time, that has a particular trajectory in time, which means that it can't go back to an initial state. It has to continue developing in time. It's non-linear. Any system is of interest to dynamical and complex systems theory. So then it comes handy, because it's almost like you can see a continuum that you apply this kind of like toolkit in a continuum from, non-living processes that we find in the natural world, such as a storm, for example, or the ocean. All of those are complex systems, right? And you can apply this same kind of like technical toolkit also to living systems, as living systems interact with the world. What makes it different, storm and the ocean, different to living systems, so natural processes different to living being processes, is just a simple fact that living beings are able to do something that natural processes can't. And that's what makes it so hard to model and to understand and to predict. It's that they can act on the environment to change their circumstances. And that's what makes it so cool, but also so difficult to understand.
Right. And by the way, where do you place in this framework the sociocultural context? I mean, the sociocultural context, I would imagine where it exists. Of course, we're talking about sociocultural animals like humans and others, but where would you place it exactly?
Yeah, okay. Super interesting. A very important question. So as we were talking about it just earlier on, when I said that the theories can be mapped out in their relation to mental representation, then the question, because we don't want to take at face value and accept the idea, the very Cartesian or the very Platonic idea that, there are already this semantic content, there is already this semantic, so it's also the nativist in psychology. There's already this semantic content in one's mind. And therefore, that's why the mind can be seen as a computer that computes and outputs a mental representation. So we want to put pressure on that and ask, where does this content come from, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what kind of like unifies a little bit all of the E's. is that rejection of that Cartesian way of thinking because of the many difficulties that you find there. Then the idea is, then the follow-up question is, where does this content come from? Where does this semantic content come from? And different E's might answer differently, right? But the way that we answer it in our paper, and the way that that is my framework, is that it is through enculturation. So as we start going to school, as we start navigating the social cultural environment, because it is a fact that once one is placed in the world, once one comes to the world, is directed towards the world, as embodied cognitive science would say, one is not developing and evolving and developing encapsulated from the social cultural environment, right? So as we are born, we start crawling, we start exploring our body to explore the environment, and we start receiving all of these cues, all of these meaningful cues from our caretakers, and we are already right there being enculturated. Of course, at that time, it is not yet symbolic enculturation. It's when we start learning numbers and then letters, and then we start putting the letters together, and we start like mumbling and saying some words, and we start understanding that some words correspond to certain things. So that's when we start very slowly scaffolding this symbolic thinking, and then we start being able to put sentences together, and then we start being able to engage in inference reasoning, starting to put out some logical thinking, one reason after the other, in order to make a point, right? So this is a process that takes place throughout development. And this development is sociocultural. So then there are aspects to the language that one speaks, the way that one speaks, and this is all part of the enculturational process, right? So having this process taking place in one side of the world is very different to taking place in a different side of the world. So here is where sociocultural practices become extremely relevant, because it is through this scaffolded process that one gains the things that, or the semantic content that Plato or Descartes would think that we would already be born with. So it is through this interacting with the world and our community around us and our caretakers that we start, and then of course then in school much more obviously, that we start being able, or we acquire and start developing a new skill. What is this skill? Is the languaging. It's the ability to describe events that happen to us, describe our experience about the world, make inferences about the future, what we think is going to happen given the patterns that I've observed throughout my experience and my autobiographical experience, right? So then here in this particular social cultural practices is where it is the potential for mental representations, as you know, orthodox analytic philosophy of mind would call it, mental representations to take place. So it's because I've been enculturated with a certain language that we share, and I've been enculturated with certain symbols that we share, that I can draw that map that will point you the way from point A to B in Lisbon, for example. We have to share so much for me to be able to do that and for you to be able to complete that task. So it's got to be through this social cultural enculturation that is shared that then it is possible for us to convey and understand semantic meanings that usually it's called in term mental representations.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that related to that, at a certain point in your paper, you say that psychological experiences cannot really be deemed objectively true or false, or be said to have any intrinsic value. Could you explain what that means exactly? And I would imagine that in this case, two very clear examples where that would apply and would be very clear for the audience would be something like religious values and moral values or cultural norms, I guess.
Yes. Okay, so that's a very important point. So the idea here is that I was just saying before, when I draw a map, Maybe you are able to, maybe I'm good at doing this and you're able to go from point A to B. And well, we can see that the map works, right? So then there are many different possibilities, theoretical possibilities to explain this, some to explain the normativity of why that's successful. But the point here is to say that there are truth conditions to that. The map worked, right? So there's got to be like some mapping of the map with the territory, right? For you to be able to complete the task with my map. So the map somewhat represents a certain slice of the reality, right? So there are truth conditions in that particular sense. What we want to say is that not all cognitive activity necessarily entails those kinds of truth conditional properties, which is the same to say that not all cognitive activity reduces to mental representation. And then we have to say, okay, now we've put out this claim, now we have to explain how is it that, what are the other aspects that are not representational, right? We need to talk about that, right? We're saying we're making a big claim against like a very rich literature in analytic philosophy of mind. So now we have to say something about and understand what are these aspects that are not representational. Why are we saying that, right? It is quite simple. It is because we are thinking of psychological experience. So the experience that we are having right now does not necessarily reduce to the words that we are saying. There is so much more meaningful context that is here, and it's necessary for the communication to occur and to be meaningful in many, many different ways. And to different people. So experience in itself is meaningful without it being already contentful. What does this mean? That experience is not contentful in the sense that one could say about experience that the experience is right or wrong, like a map. A map can be right or wrong, such that we can communicate certain meanings. Experience is, let's say, very individual, on the very individual level, right? And the experience, there is no, it would be very silly for me to say something like, let's say in a clinical practice, in a psychological or psychotherapeutic practice, someone comes in and is describing their experience of a traumatic event, let's say something like that. And it would be very silly for us to say something along the lines of, it is very incorrect for you to feel that way, right? One can say that it is reasonable given the circumstances, right? But it's not correct or incorrect. So that brings us to a point that is crucial. This must mean that experience, psychological experience, such as like watching a sunrise, going to an art gallery and admiring a painting, having a mystical experience. So I'm talking about this psychological experience that occur at an agent level and that require that the agent is already to some extent enculturated. So not all experiences are going to necessitate on symbolic tools like numbers and words. Not all psychological experiences are going to entail or necessitate on that. Some experiences are just exactly what they are. They are just psychological experience. And then later on, I can go and grab my toolkit and I can try to explain, describe what it felt like. But the experience itself is not contentful. It is later on that I can talk about it, I can think about it. Oh, why did I act in that way? Oh, maybe it was because of this, maybe it was because of that. And the reason that I can do that is because I've been enculturated with symbolic thinking that allows me to think about it. But just because I've been enculturated with this symbolic thinking and toolkit does not necessarily make the experience itself in first place contentful. So the idea is that the experiences are not right or wrong, right? We can then think about whether or not they are reasonable given the context, right? But they are not in itself, experience is not right or wrong. Therefore, the experience is not made of semantic content. That's what comes after that we can use because we've been enculturated.
Mm-hmm. And since we've talked about the sociocultural context, I guess that there's another domain where it also applies and reframes the way we think about things. So When it comes to science and science as an institution and the production of scientific knowledge, I mean, is it really possible to say, as some people argue, that science is value-free or independent of any socio-cultural context whatsoever?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great follow-up. Really good. Yes. So typically, so that we tie this up with this literature in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, typically those researchers sitting on the more cognition side, and actually, by the way, I have a paper out with my colleagues Thomas Van Ness and Guilherme Sanchez Oliveira, where we do explain science as a co-construction. And of course, we are advocating for science being theory-laden, as it is formulated. So in philosophy of science, you have two, so to speak, and this is a very reductionist way of me, but in the interest of time, there are two different sort of like positions that one can have. One is the very scientism one, which is the idea that science is neutral, as you said, and the other one is the idea that science is theory-laden or theory-valued. What does this mean? These mean, and there are many different ways in which it is possible to argue one or the other, or a middle ground even. But the idea is, from an cognitive science perspective, I think it's very safe to say that everyone that works or endorses cognitive science understands that science, okay, let me just take this one step back, that because experience is never encapsulated from the world, is always socioculturally situated, it's socioculturally situated in everything that we do. So let's go back to the scaffolding that we were doing of as human development. Babies start crawling, and they start crawling across the room because they want to reach a toy. The toy is meaningful to them, even though they have not been enculturated yet with any symbolic thinking. But they start exploring their body to explore the world, and then they start scaffolding upon this in the interactions with the other subjects around them. They start scaffolding understandings of symbols, and then we go to school, learn language, numbers. And then eventually there are people that become scientists. Mm-hmm. And as they become scientists, none of this is different. It's not like all of a sudden I became a scientist, and now as soon as I get in the gates of academia, as soon as I get into the gates of university, I'm encapsulated. I'm not a social being anymore, right? So the idea here is that in everything that we do, including science or developing an AI or developing technology, in everything that we do, we are enculturated beings ever since we were born. So even though it is understandable that we should cherish and we should encourage that we as scientists are as objective as possible, right? Believing that we are objective and we are not socioculturally situated and enculturated, it's just going to be a mistake, right? So the view is that science is a practice itself, like any other practice. It is a practice that has ways of thinking, it has ways of speaking, it has ways of doing things, just like any other practice that humans engage with, right? So that's where cognitive science would definitely think that science is a practice that is socioculturally situated with everything that we have, and it's very clear within the scientific domain that there are mainstream approaches, there are these other alternative approaches, and how things situate itself, and how science is also a negotiation between scientific communities and epistemic communities, and how science is also developed has been historically developed by a dominant narrative of the dominant group of people. It's profoundly white and westernized. So all of that is cultural, and it's undeniable.
Right. And by the way, perhaps this will be a good point, and after this I will have another question just to wrap up the interview. I think this will be a good point to go back to one of the things I mentioned earlier when I referred to my interview with Dr. Philip Hiver, where we talked about pluralistic approaches to cognitive science and psychology. So how would then the relationship between a dynamical approach to psychology and a more computational slash representational approach to psychology work? How would you look at it? I mean, would the idea here be to a dynamical approach for it to replace the more dominant approach that we still have in psychology, or to complement it? I mean, how would it work exactly?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The question is, I always think that regardless of the domain in science that one is interested in understanding and get a grasp on it, right? Regardless of the domain, one should always start with the phenomenon, right? Looking at the phenomenon and the patterns and describing it properly. What kind of phenomenon are we looking at? What are the properties of this? How can we characterize this phenomenon, right? Now, the traditional cognitive psychology uses certain kinds of approaches, right? And dynamical systems theory uses other different kinds of approaches. Now, the cognitive psychology, typically throughout history, tends to look at the psychological phenomena as a sort of like a slice of an event that is sliced in time and space.
Right.
So it's a static event that is looked at, where context, and by context I mean the developmental trajectory that brought the subject here, but I also mean context such as the embodiment in which the psychological experience happens. All of that is thrown out for the purposes of, and now, sociocultural pressure for tractable science. So in order to make it so tractable, such that I can understand by practices such as, which are the most common in psychology, in cognitive psychology, are button pushes and times responses. So I can put someone in front of a screen and ask them to perform a sort of a social cognition task, for example. Which one do you think that this represents? Is the person happy? Is the person not happy? That kind of thing. And then it's just through button pushes or time responses. So that's the most common way of experimental designs in cognitive psychology. Now, what we get out of that is tractability. And it's very publishable because it is tractable. And there is social cultural pressure for that kind of technique and for that kind of research design, because it gives us real data. Okay. Right? Now, what would be the problem with this? The problem with this is that because of the priority on the tractability and on the data, right, it may give the illusion or the impression that we are understanding something that we are not, because we reduce the phenomenon to something that is so small in order to be tractable, right? So we're not talking about, oh, it's so complex, the complexity is so high that we don't have the computational power. We are not saying that. We do say we have the computational power. It's extremely simple, and here's the data. So in order to, in those particular, if we want to give priority to the tractability, therefore the data, then we need to reduce the phenomenon of scientific interest so much that it's not complex at all. It's very easy and very tractable. Now, if we are happy with that experimental design, I wouldn't be, because it reduces the phenomenon so much that context, which is extremely relevant, doesn't matter. So that's cognitive psychology. Then you go to dynamical and complex systems theory, and the view there is that you start by looking at the phenomenon. and you describe the phenomenon, and you say that the phenomenon has high complexity. Now, I don't know if we're going to be able to make much progress from here, but we are going to try. But there's one thing that we are not going to do is to say that this is simple when this is not simple. Just look at it, right? So that's how these are different. It's just that you have, on the one hand, cognitive psychology with the pressure to publish and have data. And where is your data, right? And then for that, you need to zoom in so much that you leave so much out. And then you have the complex dynamical systems theory, which wants to look at the trajectory of the system. So then look at how different these approaches are. One looks at goes so zoomed in into the phenomenon such that it is very generalizable. Now I have this sample, I've got this data, and I can say that typically this is the case if this is the case. Right? So I can make some kind of causality and inferences about group level analysis. So I can generalize from a sample, I can generalize to a population. Scientific publishing likes that. And then on the other hand, you have approaches within cognitive science from dynamic and complex systems theory. And those approaches tend to focus on things that are less publishable, okay? Which is the individual level. So if I'm studying someone, the cognitive development is going to be everything of that individual. So you have one cognitive psychology focusing on group level, on average, generalizations to population, and you have complex systems theory fundamentally focusing on the trajectory of the individuals. So that's where the toolkit from dynamical systems theory becomes so relevant, is because it allows us to map out the trajectory of an individual in their psychological life and try to predict for that individual alone, try to predict if that individual is likely to become depressed given the trajectory that the individual is coming from. So this is very individualized, which means that science doesn't really like that because you cannot generalize it. So that's where these two approaches are different.
Okay, and just about the generalizability aspect of it, I mean, even when it comes to some of the psychological phenomena that we study through the more dominant traditional approaches in psychology, for example, even when it comes to them being as generalizable as people assume, I mean, that's also questionable, right? Because since
absolutely.
we are extracting the phenomenon from so much context and individual context and sociocultural context, for example, that's also questionable how generalizable it really is, right? And that's perhaps why we add or have things like the replication crisis, because people have been focusing too much on so-called weird populations, for example.
Absolutely, yes, 100%, absolutely, and I think that you are very right in saying that it is questionable, and I'm going to add something to it. I'm going to say that it is ethically questionable, right? It is ethically questionable that one would do that. Now that would be entering I think that not only the methodology problem, whether or not this methodology is a methodology that we should endorse, but also the ethical domain, where is it ethical from a sample to reduce the phenomenon so much that all the context and meaningful context of human behavior doesn't matter? What matters is how fast did they press the button and what button did they press? And then generalize that to a whole population, right, which has, and completely throwing away all the idiosyncrasy of living in a certain context. So that's one problem. And then we have the weird problem, right? The weird problem, which is that most of the research in cognitive psychology is research that is Western. It is usually from the population is not diverse in any form. We know that usually the population that is studied or that comprises the samples is students at the university. So that's the age interval that is usually used, and these are educated people, westernized, with the same kind of like age, similar age. So that's the weird problem, is that we are generalizing something that is not even generalizable. How is it that a group of the same kind of social group is going to be generalizable to the rest of the population of the world? And then we say, well, this is, you know, cognitive psychology, this is what science says, it's that it should be like that. Well, it is potentially like that, potentially, and very potentially like that for that particular kind of very homogeneous kind of group, and very potentially. So even in there, I would be concerned, but generalizing the weird population into the population of the world with all the richness, cultural richness and diversity that it has, that is the weird problem.
Right. So just one last question, and then I hope we get enough time to talk about this. So earlier we mentioned for e-cognition, and in our previous conversation we talked a bit about AI systems. So do you think it would make sense to think that AI could become human-like? And of course, being human-like is a huge conversation and discussion to have. But if those AI systems are not embodied, at least?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Yeah, so now you have these two routes. So one route is to say that the mark of the mental is mental representation, right? No. If you go this route and you say, well, by mental representation being everything that is symbolic, semantic, then if you go to this route, what happens is it's very easy to argue that AIs are already quite human-like, are already cognitive, yeah, right? If you take that path.
Sure.
Then you have the other option, which is the option where you say that cognitive activity does not reduce to mental representation. Mental representation is a part of some activities that humans engage with, provided that they've been enculturated, right? And AIs are hardly enculturated and develop in the same kind of like time scales, etc., that we do, right? With all the sociality and social cultural practices that are required to do that. So if you take this second option, this second route, then you are going to end up saying that AI is not aligned, is not similar, is not analogous, and it's very hardly going to be to humans. Actually, what you're going to end up realizing is that AI is a construction of human beings, in the same way that human beings scaffold all of their scientific or all of their symbolic structures in order to then produce computers, produce computational power, and eventually AI. AI is a continuation, all of that production, all of that scientific-technical production. AI is that continuation of that. And it may be the case that what happens is that these AIs, like large language models that are very much in the hype at the moment, large language models, what they are doing is they are resembling a part of what we can do, which is to language, to express thinking, to reason. So, but that's just one part. If, of course, if you are with the cognitive science, that's just one part of what we do. There is so much more that is involved in having a cognitive engaging with the world and interaction with the world that is not reducible to producing text, thoughts, thinking, right? But if you would take this other route and you would say, well, the mark of the mental is mental representation, there's a computation that outputs a mental representation, which would be text, for example, then you could very well argue that ChatGPT is very cognitive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So let's wrap up the interview then. And Inês, would you like to mention again for the audience where they can find your work on the internet?
Yeah, thank you so much. So basically on my website, that's what is always updated, just www.ineshippolito.com. Everything is usually updated there, and my email is also there if anybody's interested in contacting me. Yeah, just there.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming on the show again. It's always fun and a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, likewise. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me. It's always so much fun. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, a comment, and if you can, please support me on Patreon or PayPal. You can find the links down in the description box. Just $1 per month would already be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. And I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Perga Larsen, Jerry Mueller, Hans Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andrea, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Beck, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edith Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Morey, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Herringbone, Starry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zuel, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Ben-Zuliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowleys, Kate Von Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, and Masood Ali Mohammadi. Special thanks to my producers Izar Webb, Jim Franks, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hughney, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Al Nick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Vege G. Thank you for all.